Enjoyment within the educated bourgeoisie has never been merely sensual fulfillment, but has always reflected an inner claim to not only experience oneself, the environment, and the culture in which one lives, but to penetrate them deeply. This attitude permeated not only everyday life, but also shaped family structures and social relationships. Within the family, enjoyment was often passed down in ritualized form, from the grandmother who set the porcelain only on special days, to the father who told a small cultural historical anecdote during dinner. Enjoyment became narrative, an attitude, a familial choreography. Particularly striking here is the role of language. The educated bourgeoisie does not only enjoy, it also talks about enjoyment. In the choice of words when describing a tea, praising an interpretation, or discussing a play, the fine differentiation of taste becomes apparent. A taste that does not want to be loud, but to have effect. The language of enjoyment is not necessarily that of desire. It is rarely physical, rarely immediate. Rather, what is tasted, seen, or heard is filtered through associations, knowledge, and references. A meal is not only tasted, but recalls a childhood recipe, a book about regional cuisine, or a trip to southern France. Enjoyment is deepened by what one knows about it, but it can also be inhibited. For when enjoyment is overloaded with knowledge, an overwhelming effect can occur. The question arises, is it still possible to simply enjoy without carrying an inner discourse alongside? May enjoyment also be naive? Or is this precisely the point at which bourgeois culture becomes most evident, in the inability to surrender when it is not reflected upon? Especially compared to other social milieus, it becomes clear how strongly enjoyment in the educated bourgeoisie is not only cultivated, but also controlled. While in hedonistic or consumer-oriented milieus, enjoyment is often the goal itself, it remains in the educated bourgeoisie a means to an end, a medium of self-education, engagement with the world, cultural participation. The cup of tea becomes the pause in which one reads Rilke. The museum visit becomes a search for traces, not a distraction. The choice of a handcrafted tea from a rare growing region instead of a mass-produced product is not only a matter of taste, but of lifestyle, attitude, perhaps also of distinction. Enjoyment thereby is morally charged. It is not only about what one consumes, but how and why. Is the tea sustainably grown? Was it carefully harvested? Has one taken enough time to consciously enjoy it? This moral coding of enjoyment brings a paradoxical tension with it. On the one hand, one wants to be open, curious, and capable of enjoyment. On the other hand, there is the constant suspicion of misstep, tastelessness, lack of depth. This ambivalence leads to enjoyment in the educated bourgeoisie often being embedded in a discourse of justification. One may appreciate, for example, a special handcrafted bookbinding or a rare edition of a literary classic, but it should be one whose creation story one knows, whose historical significance one can reflect on, and about which one can exchange with others. The ability to enjoy becomes a cultural competence, and this must be proven again and again through choice, conversation, subtle references. The educated bourgeoisie sees itself as a middle class oriented upwards, not economically, but culturally. Enjoyment becomes a tool of this self-positioning. It is neither flashy nor random. Rather, it is conscious, reduced, meaningful. One does not indulge in everything, but in the right things. This search for the right enjoyment is, however, not a rigid rule, but a constant process of negotiation. The question of what good taste is remains open, but is performed permanently within the milieu, through recommendations, reviews, conversations, but also through ironic ruptures and self-reflective distance. Thus, even the pleasure of pop music, a well-produced pop song, a trashy film classic, can under certain conditions be appropriated in a bourgeois manner, provided it is understood as a conscious transgression, a game with codes. Gender-specific differences also become apparent here. Male-coded enjoyment in the educated bourgeoisie has traditionally articulated itself in fields such as jazz, philosophy, and craftsmanship, with a tendency toward expertise and a certain pathos. Female enjoyment, on the other hand, was long associated with domestic, softer spheres: culinary art, interior design, literary sensibility. Only in recent decades have these attributions begun to dissolve, not least through feminist critique of the gendered loading of taste and education. Today, it is increasingly female voices that reconceptualize the idea of enjoyment as a self-determined, polyphonic intercultural practice. Intergenerational ruptures also play a role. While older educated bourgeoisie members grew up with the classical canon, from Thomas Mann to Mahler, a new generation is growing up that prefers other media, languages, and forms of expression. The podcast replaces the feuilleton. The graphic novel stands on equal footing with the novel. Enjoyment shifts from contemplative experience to dialogical exchange, from exclusive knowledge to shared experience. Yet the basic structure remains. Enjoyment is more than consumption. It is always also a comment on life. This shift is also evident in everyday architecture. Where once the bookshelf was a status symbol, today it is the open kitchen with a spice rack, a sourdough jar, and a Japanese ceramic knife. Enjoyment has not disappeared. It has only changed its surface. The principles remain similar. Less is more. Quality over quantity. Reduction instead of excess. The difference lies in aesthetics, not in attitude. Today's form of bourgeois enjoyment also wants to say something, only perhaps quieter, subtler, less dogmatic. New fields also open up: sustainability, mental health, social responsibility. Enjoyment is thought ecologically, for example, in the question of whether a coffee indulgence is justifiable if rainforest destruction is involved, or whether the concert was organized by an institution that pays fair fees. Enjoyment becomes relational, and thus ethically more complex. The educated bourgeoisie often does not perceive this complexity as a burden, but as an incentive. One wants to enjoy properly, consciously, informed, responsibly. Yet even this attitude is not free of ambivalence, because the more enjoyment is moralized, the greater the risk that it loses its lightness and becomes yet another obligation in the repertoire of life management. Perhaps therein lies the real challenge. Enjoyment within the educated bourgeoisie lives from a paradox. It seeks depth, but without heaviness. It searches for meaning, but without pathos. It wants to shape, but without control. Enjoyment should flow and yet be considered. It is a dance on the threshold, between self-control and surrender, between aesthetics and ethics, between distinction and openness. Mastering this dance is no easy exercise. It is a lifelong process, an inner discourse, an art form. Yet precisely in this imperfection, in this constant movement, lies the allure. Enjoyment in the educated bourgeoisie is not a concluded state, but a path, a striving not only to endure life, but to shape it, with style, meaning, substance. Perhaps the bourgeoisie is not what one possesses, but how one positions oneself toward the world. With respect, with discernment, with a fine sensibility for what touches and what remains. Enjoyment is then not merely a matter of taste. It is an expression of relationship to the world, and as such, it remains open for change, for critique, for new voices. Not to give oneself up, but to develop further. Because enjoyment that is not capable of change petrifies, and a bourgeoisie that can no longer question loses its spirit. Perhaps true enjoyment today lies not in the perfection of a ritual, but in the art of allowing oneself to be surprised, in listening, in allowing, in the willingness to be moved by something unexpected, and precisely therein, in this mixture of knowledge and wonder, of attitude and openness, bourgeois enjoyment may find its deepest meaning, not as a possession, but as movement, not as exclusion, but as invitation, not as a rule book, but as possibility.